Oakland, produced the film in order to explore the root causes of homelessness, identify best practices that have worked elsewhere in the country, and present actionable steps that we can take to address homelessness in San Francisco. Sharing this insightful film with the public flows from the mission of RescueSF. RescueSF is a citywide coalition of residents advocating for compassionate and effective solutions to homelessness in San Francisco. We organize residents and we advocate for effective government policies. We're hosting this discussion to explore the issues raised in the film, and we are delighted to bring together an excellent panel. Several of the panel members appeared in the film. I'll now introduce the panelists. Gabriel Baldinucci is the co-founder and CEO of Urban Vision Alliance, which brings together key stakeholders across industries and the public sector to solve homelessness. Lori Brook is a co-founder of RescueSF and a community organizer with over 20 years of experience. Lori is also the president of the Cow Hollow Association. Theo Ellington is a vice president of public affairs at Strategies 360, a research, public affairs, and communications firm. Theo previously worked at the Salvation Army, where he helped lead the project, The Way Out. Major Matthew Madsen is the divisional secretary for San Francisco for the Salvation Army. He's a leader of the Salvation Army's project, The Way Out. Mary Thoreau is the chair and chief executive of the Independent Institute in Oakland. The Independent Institute produced the film Beyond Homeless, and Mary was the main interviewer in the film. Mary is the former chair and current member of the advisory board of the San Francisco Salvation Army. Tom Wolf is a formerly homeless recovering heroin addict from San Francisco. Tom is an advocate for addressing our crises of homelessness and drug addiction. When we sent the announcement of this discussion, we included a link to watch the film online. In case anyone on this call hasn't had a chance to watch the film, we'd like to set the tone by showing the film's short trailer. Mary, can you please share your screen and play the trailer?
Absolutely, thank you.
San Francisco, the city by the sea.
California really was the Golden State when I arrived in the 70s. The streets of San Francisco were vibrant, free, and filled with hope. Now my beloved San Francisco has become known as ground zero for our nation's homelessness crisis.
Things are worse now for the homeless than ever.
San Franciscans have reached a tipping point.
After 40 years of failed approaches to reverse homelessness here, these once hopeful streets are filled with despair and brokenness. And until we tackle this problem, this will be our narrative.
There isn't enough drug treatment for everybody in the city.
What are you doing with all this money that has been allotted to the city? Where's that going?
So there's almost no development that anyone has a legal right to do in California.
We have pitted the smallest differences against each other.
You cannot arrest this issue away. You cannot arrest homelessness away.
Nobody is doing anything transformational.
Leaving people untreated is murder.
We're throwing vast resources at this issue, and it just keeps going up. Really, we can't come up with anything better than that?
Beyond Homeless, Finding Hope is an exploration of what's driving the homelessness crisis here in California, and a look at alternative approaches around the country that offer hope with real solutions. Join us in changing the narrative of our nation's homelessness crisis.
So I hope that everyone had a chance to watch the film. If you haven't, you can find a link on the announcement that we sent with the about this webinar, and feel free to email us. We can also send that to you. So I'd like to start with a question for Mary Thoreau, the film's producer and the main interviewer. Mary, at the outset of the film, you set ambitious goals to identify the root causes of homelessness and to identify solutions that can work here in San Francisco. What are the film's main conclusions about root causes and solutions for homelessness?
Well, the root causes of homelessness are incredibly individual. One thing I learned by interviewing people was that almost everyone who's experiencing homelessness has a different story, and there are about as many causes of becoming homeless as there are individuals who are experiencing homelessness. So the approach that's currently being used to just apply a one-size-fits-all of, oh, it's just housing. So if we put people into housing, the problem is solved. Turns out not to be true. It's not just housing, it's trauma, childhood trauma, adult trauma, such as with Tom, and trauma leading to mental illness and addiction to deal with being home. You know, you become homeless and you start using substances to deal with the problem, or become homeless because you have a substance addiction problem. All kinds of problems, and that's why we need to address it on an individualized basis. So the model that we showcase, the Haven for Hope in San Antonio, which has solved the issue at scale citywide. It's the only program we found in the country that's solving the problem for an entire city. It's a city about twice the size of San Francisco. And at any given time, they're helping 1,700 people in the residential program, as well as outsource programs for others. And they deal, again, they're dealing with each individual. Each individual comes in, they say, okay, tell us your story. Tell us what happened to you. And then they design programming to meet that individual's needs, to help that person achieve their full potential. And they're remarkably successful. The other thing we learned is that money does not correlate with success. San Francisco is spending enormous amounts on homelessness. Its current budget is supposed to be $1.2 billion annually on homelessness, and homelessness just keeps going up despite their recent proclamation of the point in time count where unsheltered homelessness, they're saying, is going down. However, that's a little disingenuous because they're not including sheltered homelessness, which of course during COVID, they put a lot of people into hotel rooms and others. So we are continuing to go up despite these enormous amount of money that we're spending. San Antonio, meanwhile, spends a fraction of what San Francisco spends and is achieving enormous success.
Thank you. We're going to continue asking questions of our panel, but at the end of this session, if there are questions from the audience who'd like to share those, please feel free, members of the audience, to put your questions in the chat, and we'll go through those. And then at the end, we'll be able to share some of your questions with the panelists. Tom Wolfe, you played a significant role in the film. You talked about your personal experience living on the streets, and you explained how addiction can push people into homelessness and keep people on the streets. What is the best way to help unhoused people dealing with substance use disorder? What should be done if people say they're not ready to address their addiction?
Well, that's a tough question. So look, we're talking about two different subsets of individuals. So there are people that use drugs that live indoors. And while there are issues with that, especially in subsidized housing, they're indoors. People that are using on the street that are sleeping rough, within that group, there's a subset of people. There is a subset of people that require some type of intervention in order to address their addiction or untreated mental illness. Otherwise, what you have is what you see now out on the street, where in San Francisco, you have 5,000 to 6,000 people between the Tenderloin and South of Market and the Mission District and Hayes Valley and Haight-Ashbury that are struggling with late-stage addiction and untreated mental illness that are being left to their own devices because of a term called body autonomy, where we're giving so much respect to their individual rights, despite the fact that they are also having to, sometimes break the law to support their addiction, i.e. boost and steal, things like that. That's just a reality of being an addict on the street. Drug addiction is a disease. We need to treat it like that. So there does need to be a healthcare approach. But recovery, one of the foundations of recovery from addiction is also accountability. And that once you're in recovery, you have to own many of the things that you did in your addiction. So we need to find a way to blend those two together. And I think the idea of what's happening at Haven for Hope with a therapeutic community is a great kind of way to land in the middle on this issue, so that we're not just doing shelters and we're not waiting around for 10 years or longer for housing that may or may not ever come. We're actually finding a solution in between where we're providing actual housing and a therapeutic community where someone can not only find recovery, but kind of get back on track and redevelop their life and find purpose, which is really the key for so many that are out on the street.
Mary made a really important observation from the film that there's so many different paths that people follow to get into homelessness. It's hard to generalize because people are individuals. It's quite meaningful to recognize that. From your experience, though, can you make some generalizations about the willingness of people to, the interest of people on the streets to get into treatment? To what extent is the problem the lack of adequate service options? To what extent is it the lack of people being ready right now?
Well, you have to think about the atmosphere that they are part of. Okay, so if you're homeless in the Tenderloin and someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, are you interested in going to drug treatment?" Well, first of all, most people that are on the street have had experience with the criminal justice system, so there is some mistrust of someone approaching you to do outreach. At the same time, there's also like a methadone clinic on Turk and Hyde in San Francisco. And Turk and Hyde, up until recently, was ground zero for the drug dealing that was happening in the city. So if you're someone that's on the street that's trying to find recovery and you start using that methadone clinic for treatment, and then you walk out of that methadone clinic, there's 20 drug dealers on the corner ready to sell you illicit fentanyl. So how are you ever going to get clean in that type of environment? So we have to talk about the atmosphere, the environment, and that means we have to talk about something called open drug scenes and what we need to do to break those up so that we can foster an environment of recovery for people and healing and peace, and that helps reduce the trauma on the street, and that in and of itself is a form of harm reduction. And we need to start thinking about ways that we can institute that type of approach, especially here in San Francisco.
Theo Ellington, when you were interviewed in the film, you were working with the Salvation Army. You're now working for a public affairs firm, helping organizations advance their agendas with the government sector. How would you characterize the current attitude toward homelessness policy inside San Francisco City Hall? Is City Hall embracing the kinds of integrated and collaborative policies discussed in the film, like Haven for Hope? Is the city ready to have this kind of conversation?
Yeah, so I think it's no question that this is the number one issue facing every major city across the United States. It's the most visible issue that as a resident we see in every neighborhood across San Francisco. But I think there's sort of one common misconception that we don't really talk about when we talk about sort of cities or municipalities and this crisis, particularly here in San Francisco. The city of San Francisco can't solve this crisis alone. I would even go as far to make the argument that cities in general aren't necessarily equipped to solve homeless crisis. I mean, they're restrictive by nature. You look at the legislative process and the executive branch, all the red tape, the budget constraints. Municipalities often have to be reactive and they respond to the current conditions. But if we peel back the layers on sort of the philosophical view, San Francisco, unfortunately, has been governing on two totally different extremes. I like to say they're on the edge of both sides of those extremes. The debates are normally driven by if you're progressive or moderate, harm reduction or recovery. Are you for the recall or do you hate the mayor? These senseless debates have, people are suffering because of these senseless debates. So I think public policy has suffered, right? You look at A Place for All. There was a piece of legislation that Raphael Mandelman wrote. It took 2 years. It was like a 2-year process to go through the Board of Supervisors and various stakeholders. Like senseless debates, progressive moderates. We shouldn't be having these conversations. You look at mental health SF and the goal of getting folks off the streets and ensuring that folks have the necessary care they need. Again, these programs take a long time to sort of get up and running. The Linkage Center, not necessarily as effective as it should be because there's no place to onboard people once they leave that facility. So I think all in all, there's endless examples that I can bring up, but all in all, to address this crisis, we need to do so regionally, but we also need to understand the role of our nonprofit service providers, the private sector, community foundations, right? These are the organizations that are way more nimble than government. This is not a government alone solution. So I think that the city first has to stop the senseless debates and then figure out how we have a coordinated system between the private sector, between nonprofit service providers and government. We got to find that sweet spot.
You make a really important point. RescueSF is a resident organization. We just started as residents, and we decided that we had better ask City Hall what the problem is. There's a problem on our streets. People are suffering. We look to City Hall for a solution. And what we've learned is exactly what you pointed out, that so much of the solution has to come from the state and especially the federal government. But yet people blame the city for the problem because it's right here, it's local. So what would be your advice then as a person who's focused on public affairs? How do we, it's very easy for us to get access to City Hall here, but where is the opportunity to work with others to influence policy, much well beyond San Francisco at the state level and also the federal level?
Yeah, I think your model is exactly what is needed across the region, right? You're a group of residents who are concerned about the process, and if you get enough people who are concerned about the process, you start to make a little bit of noise, and you start to kick down the doors at City Hall. Those are the type of voices that we need at the table. I mentioned earlier, the private sector needing to step in and provide innovative sort of solutions. We look at organizations like a Pallet Shelter, right, who are innovative. They found a cost-effective way to build and solve for the interim housing problem, right? That's something that government couldn't necessarily do on their own, right? They operated quickly and they operated more efficiently in terms of price. You look at other nonprofit service providers, again, RescueSF, right? A resident-led group that literally has gone and taken time to go to community by community to actually hear the voices and take those voices into City Hall on behalf of those folks. Those are the type of things we need when I talk about that sort of trifecta of community, nonprofits, service providers, government. That's what's needed.
Major Madsen, the film identified Haven for Hope as a potential role model for how communities can use an innovative approach to help people end their homelessness and live productive, healthy, independent lives. The Salvation Army here in San Francisco has developed the Way Out program. What is the Way Out proposal and what is its current status here in the city?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. And folks, if you haven't watched the documentary, you need to see it. It really is a great conversation starter and an eye opener. The Way Out is something the Salvation Army has been working on throughout the pandemic, actually even before the pandemic. And it's based upon this book written by the founder of the Salvation Army called In Darkest England and the Way Out. And what was happening back in the 1860s in London during the time of Jack the Ripper, there were bodies piled up on the streets. We think things are bad in San Francisco now. It's nothing compared to what they were dealing with back then. And he said, we got to do something. We need to find a way out of this. And so the Salvation Army really mobilized and got things going. And what they were doing was taking people from their circumstances, their situations, removing them, helping them clean their lives up, get off of the alcohol or whatever the drug was that they may have been using, and to train them and equip them and prepare them to be able to be self-sustaining and be a contributing member to society. And there was the book outlines exactly how it was going to happen. Well, we want to make the Way Out for San Francisco, and it's so necessary. We know that we're not going to be able to solve it all on our own. No one entity can. But as the Salvation Army can work alongside other agencies and the government, and we get in our lane and we do what we do in our lane as well as we can, I think we're going to really start moving this and get across the goal line. The Salvation Army has been in San Francisco for almost 140 years now. We've had fantastic success in our rehabilitation programs. We are very effective in a lot of the programs and ministries that we have around, not just San Francisco, but around the world. And one thing that we have going for us, in addition to our success and our history, is we've acquired a number of properties over the years. In 140 years, we've had a lot of property, and we are actually in the process of redeveloping those properties. Where our very first property, we've got 5 properties that we're looking at redeveloping and turning into housing where individuals can live and be part of this extended recovery program with wraparound services. We're already right now working with an architect on the very first rebuilds of this property at what we own at 850 Harrison. And that property will have about a 450 person capacity, and it'll allow people to have the stability that they need with the wraparound services, the workforce development, all the stuff that people seem to forget. You think you just put them in a house and they'll be fine, put them in a hotel room, they'll be fine. But what got them into the street in the first place? We need to fix the reason they got there. And that's what the Way Out is to be a holistic approach to help heal the individual so they can be a part of society once again.
I think people on the call should understand the scale of this. If you watch the film, you saw some really great video shots of the campus for Haven for Hope. I think it's 22 acres, and it's a massive campus in San Antonio. And tell people here on the call, Major, about the properties you have, but also, as I recall, the total project could have up to 1,700 beds. It'd be the largest facility of its kind in the country. And talk about that, as well as a little more detail on the stages people would go through to let people know kind of what this involves, the time period, the length of time they'd be there as well.
Absolutely. So what Mark is asking me to kind of flesh out a little bit here, and I'm more than happy to do so, is, I mentioned that we have 5 properties that we're considering redesigning, and we're working on those plans as we speak. And what these properties are going to be locations where we have an extension of what we already do through our Harbor Light program. It's a program we've been operating for many years where people come with addiction and recovery needs, and we help them get off of whatever it is that they're dealing with, and then help start to address their issues. There's a lot of mental health issues, to be honest. There's a lot of work. People have a lot of barriers. We help eliminate those barriers. If you don't have ID or you've got things that are prohibiting you from being able to work, we help remove those. Then we're working with a number of partners, very large groups in various industries to help people find work. While all this is going on, they will be housed in one of these facilities that we are building out. And as Mark mentioned, the massing studies that we've had done of all of our properties, we could build up to about 1,700 people as a capacity across all of the network of our properties. And in order to do that, of course, it's going to take money. It doesn't build itself. But we got to start small. We got to start where we're at, and that's where we're at with this 850 Harrison property. We want to continue to build on this momentum that we have. Right now, we're running like a proving stage where we're calling it a pilot project, but we're just this extension of what we've been doing at Harbor Light. We've been implementing these things, and we're looking at a 90% success rate so far. Could you imagine if we could fill just 1,000 beds and have a 90% success rate? And after someone's gone through our program, let's say they stay an additional 2 years. It's not going to be forever. We want people to be independent. But once they get to that point of stability, then they can move on. Let's say every 2 years, you're putting 90% of 1,000 people back out into society being contributing members. We really start making a massive difference in the homelessness problem and crisis in the city. And that's really what the goal is.
Tom Wolf, as a person with lived experience of homelessness and drug addiction, what's your perspective on the Salvation Army's project? Can this make a difference in San Francisco?
Well, absolutely, it can make a difference because it's addressing two of the biggest drivers that we talk about in the whole issue of homelessness. It addresses the issue of the much needed housing. I think that we all have to admit that there is a housing crisis in the state of California, especially an affordable housing crisis. And it also addresses the other elephant in the room, which is drug addiction and recovery. So they're actually creating a space for those that wish to live in an environment of recovery to have real supportive housing that actually is under a recovery, what they call a recovery-oriented system of care, right? As opposed to putting someone in an SRO in San Francisco that has some services in that there's like one case manager for 60 residents, as an example, that's in the heart of the Tenderloin, where you have 10 drug dealers literally waiting outside your door. And if you're a person that's in recovery and there are people on the same floor as you using drugs at the same time, that is not a recovery-oriented environment for them in which to heal, right? So this actually fills that space perfectly of creating a ton of new housing in San Francisco, which is what we need, and also creating a space for a ton of people that want to pursue a life in recovery and that they have a place to go that's safe, that's nurturing, where they can work on redeveloping their life and finding purpose. I mean, that was one of the biggest challenges for me early in my recovery, was reestablishing myself. And if I didn't have like a supportive environment in which to do that, I don't know what would have happened. And I'll be honest with you, it took me 2 years after I was sober to even open a bank account. These are the types of challenges that people that experience homelessness and the criminal justice system and drug addiction face. And they need to have that type of environment that's going to support them in the right way. And the only way for them to really be successful for many people, not everyone, but for many, many people like myself, was to be in a safe place where I could pursue my recovery and not have to worry about being swarmed by drug dealers, being swarmed by drug dealers even on the inside sometimes of the facility, and then actually having a safe, clean facility in which I can pursue my recovery and pursue rebuilding my life. So I think that this is a great opportunity for San Francisco, and San Francisco really should embrace this. And I hope that the city government actually steps forward and embraces this model as a way forward for San Francisco. You're going to start seeing this more and more as the crisis around addiction and drugs and homelessness deepens. You're going to see more and more conversations, even at the state level, about therapeutic communities here in California. And I really think that that is a great interim solution that can also manifest into more housing. So it's just kind of like a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, Theo, in the film, you shared some statistics comparing success rates for programs that are just sort of a 6 month detox versus the kind of 2 to 3 year program the Salvation Army is proposing. You want to just maybe summarize those numbers again and kind of explain why the Salvation Army is able to get so much better success rates with a longer program?
Sure. I think first off, as Major Matt mentioned, this is not just sort of your 3 month or 6 month program, right? A lot of times what we're seeing is someone comes off the streets or they go into the city's coordinated entry system, they come into a program that is 3 months or 6 months. And then after that, they either get placed or they're left to the whim of the market to find a place on their own. 9 times out of 10, they're put in a place with no supportive services. So they fall back into homelessness. In fact, they fall into a deeper state of homelessness. What we have found by way of the Salvation Army being one of the largest addiction treatment providers in the world is that if you keep folks under care for 2 to 3 years, they have a 90% more. They have a 90% chance of continuing to live a life of sobriety compared to a 10% chance if they leave at that 6 month mark. And as Major Matt mentioned, it's not just we're going to throw you in a home and call it a day. It's those deep, individualized services. Gabriel, I'm stealing this term from you, but the integrated services. It's about saying, client X, we are going to take you to another organization, not to, navigate this crazy system by yourself, but we are going to hand you off to someone we know, and we're going to hold that person accountable, and we're going to hold you accountable to making sure you're doing what you need to do. So it's not necessarily case management. We're helping folks navigate this system that, imagine coming off of homelessness or being on the streets, navigating any system. Thomas Wolfe mentioned not being able to get a bank account for 2 years. These are barriers to employment. You think when you go out and get a job, they don't sort of do reference checks, or they don't do things that, to make sure that you're sort of sound. So during that 2 years, it's the workforce development, it's the barrier removal services, it's the life skills, connecting them to other organizations that have the sort of wherewithal to absorb additional clients and take on more services. So that's really the difference. Major Matt, you can jump in. But that is the sort of core of where how we get to that 90%.
Gabriel Balducci, the film shows that the initiative behind Haven for Hope in San Antonio came from a collaboration involving government, private businesses, and nonprofit service providers. You are a co-founder of the Urban Vision Alliance, and RescueSF is a member of UVA. How does UVA operate, and what is UVA trying to achieve in San Francisco? And then beyond that, what are the main obstacles to launching a Haven for Hope style solution in San Francisco, such as the Salvation Army is proposing?
There's a reason that cities have struggled to replicate what Haven for Hope did. 180 partners, 70 nonprofits integrated in delivering their services, a very large vision that aligned everyone in the county and the city. So Theo, you heard him talk about how cities aren't set up to solve homelessness. They're not structured for it. I had this conversation last night with city officials from LA. County has a lot of control. You also heard Theo say the private sector has to step up. There's got to be an important role for the private sector to play. Well, there's not an easy way for the private sector to do that. We really are missing some of the systemic structure at the highest levels. And what we're trying to do at Urban Vision Alliance is build the strategies, alliances, and tools that enable cities to have the kind of collective action that's required to do large scale facilities, to help get those Salvation Army way out buildings developed in San Francisco and other projects as well. There's a way for everyone in the city to know these projects exist, to have an easy way to engage, and more importantly, for us to position them as a comprehensive portfolio that make up parts of a solution versus a series of fragmented projects. I'd say the biggest challenge is definitely getting the level of collaboration that you really need. And that is what we're hoping that our approach and tools will address. We started with the Salvation Army and Dignity Moves because it's a large scale project. And now we've recruited 30 other organizations in an alliance to help develop those properties. And now we're building a platform so that we can make it not just easier for people that are outside of the industry who are not involved in homelessness in any way to help and to get involved. Companies like Nextdoor, who just joined our alliance, large furniture companies, construction companies, architects, but even organizations that are already working together, even county and city, to make it easier for everyone to collaborate on a large scale solution like a Haven for Hope solution.
The film told the story of how Haven for Hope got started. And it began with, on the political side, with the mayor of San Antonio wanting to take action and reaching out to the private sector, and then finding someone who's a really key driver to be able to mobilize the private sector behind the project. Here, though, you have a different model. It's really starting with the private sector. You're recruiting private sector collaborators. To what extent are you able to get the public sector involved? To what extent do you need the public sector involved?
Well, I think we need the public sector involved. And I think and I've traveled around to different cities. I've been to Haven for Hope many times. I was there last week for a screening of this film and a panel, and talking to them about their experience and talking to them about all the cities they talk to about their experiences. And it's really clear that you really want to mobilize your private sector first. And it's almost a prerequisite before you can really align all of the existing operators, the nonprofit sector and others. Their heads are down, they're trying to do what they're doing, they're scraping by, they're working hard, it's tough. And if you just come in and try to align them, you're adding friction to their daily operations. But you can mobilize the private sector, and that is really going to be the big driver. So we're hoping to see the same kind of phase transition that you saw, that you're seeing in other cities. Now, San Antonio was an outlier because the mayor and a super influential person in the business community came together and drove it. But I think in most cities, you might wind up having the RescueSFs and Urban Vision Alliances and others. If we can enable a platform for the private sector to get together, then that's the other way you get there, the business community.
And then it seems like finding the right participants in a coalition is important and bring them together, but then ultimately it comes down to capital, right? And that's, you have to raise the capital to make these projects happen. Is that sort of the next big obstacle?
Yeah, and I should say that everyone will tell you that public-private partnerships are the only way to get this done. And so what we're really focused on is how do you make it really a lot easier for public-private partnerships to happen around this topic, because that doesn't just unlock expertise. It aligns everyone around a vision and it aligns the city. But yes, it unlocks capital. And we found we can unlock tons of resources when we start to shift that narrative. And that's really what it does, is it shifts the culture around homelessness from when is the city going to solve this to what can our firm contribute and what can we achieve together? And that's where you get massive resources that are unlocked. And those resources tend to drive even more alignment in kind of a positive cycle.
And can you just put a little more detail there? How does UVA do that? Because they're making it easier for different organizations to get involved and unlock those resources.
Sure. Well, for example, with the Way Out initiative and also with Dignity Moves project at 33 Golf, we were able to recruit several companies from the real estate industry to donate pro bono and in-kind services to reduce the cost per bed on those. And that's work that the Salvation Army didn't have to do. That's a service that we provided to those organizations who said they cared about homelessness and they wanted to help. They just didn't know how. And so there's a missing marketplace here for people who want to help and organizations that need resources and help. And that's where we're really operating. Eventually, we'll move from doing that manually to the platform that we're developing.
Lori Brooke, my RescueSF co-founder. Public opinion polls show that residents see homelessness as the top issue facing San Francisco. Yet in discussions of homelessness, we rarely hear the voices of housed residents. How is RescueSF bringing residents' voices to City Hall, and are residents' voices making a difference?
Yes and yes. So I'll tell you a little bit more. So as Mark mentioned, I'm also the president of the Cal Hollow Association, and that's somewhere where this began, where residents were really frustrated about what was happening in the city. And similar to what some of the other panelists have mentioned is, and the businesses feel, is they didn't know where they could help. They didn't know how they could help. They knew there was a problem, but where can I participate? And the outreach that we were hearing was from the residents wasn't anger. It was frustration, certainly, but it was more, tell me what I can do. Let me participate. And so that's kind of the foundation upon which we began, which was to bring residents together, teach each other what is going on in the city. And we knew, so here we are in District 2, I mean, the Cal Hollow Association, that our voices from just one part of the city, we're able to address issues within our district and our supervisor. But we certainly, just being District 2, cannot impact a citywide issue such as housing or homelessness or crime. So from the very beginning, when we decided to step forward with this idea, was we had to have a citywide voice. And so because of Zoom, because it started right before COVID, we started to get on the phone with all the different neighborhood leaders across the city. And now 2 years later, we are engaged with about 45 different neighborhood associations and community benefit districts across all 11 supervisory districts. So that has been the big difference that we bring for residents. So we're a platform and a voice, a citywide voice that gets listened to. And so what do we do with that voice? So here we've garnered it, and how do we make it effective? And so in the beginning, when we decided to take on the issue of homelessness, since it was the top issue for residents, we knew that Mark and Lori, we did not know everything we needed to know about it. So we started to have speaker series, and we would talk to anyone and everyone that in the area of homelessness. We're not ideological, we're not partisan. We go by data and best practices. So we had a speaker series, we made it available to the public, and we started to learn a lot. And with that, we learned what the city was doing well and where there were major gaps. And so what we did is we thought, okay, here's a gap. What is a constructive policy that we can put forth to the city? And as we started to meet with the supervisors, we don't just meet as RescueSF, we bring their trusted constituents with us. And we offer up ideas and we say, how can we help? And I will tell you, honestly, from the mayor's office to the supervisors to the department heads, they've been very receptive to that approach. We don't show up with our hair on fire. We show up with wanting to help solve the problem. And in most cases, they're like, thank you for doing some of the legwork already. And yes, let's see how we can pursue this. A very specific example, of course, is Supervisor Mandelman's A Place for All, where he had this legislation 2 years ago. And he reached out and he said, can I talk to your coalition and share what this idea is and hear what residents are thinking about, what works about it and what doesn't, and then we can fine tune it. And that's exactly how it went for the last 2 years until yesterday. It was finally approved unanimously by the Board of Supervisors. But it was a process. And I will say that, we hear that from various corners that residents stop projects, and if, residents weren't in the way, things would be different. And there are times when resident groups and individual residents stop projects because oftentimes they don't feel heard. They don't feel like they're part of the process. They don't feel like their concerns are being addressed. And so what we try to do is, take it on the road, go out to the different neighborhood associations. And when we have ideas, and one of the first ones that we push forward, because we heard it was working in other cities like San Jose and Seattle and Oakland, was the interim shelter cabins. San Francisco didn't have anything like this. We had congregate shelter. There was SROs, of course, was one of their housing solution. The NAV centers were some little hybrid in between, but there wasn't these individual cabins with wraparound services. They didn't have it at all. It wasn't even on the to-do list. So working with Tipping Point, we proposed this idea. They eventually bought into it and donated. Here's a philanthropic and public venture. They put forth $1 million for the cabins, and Dignity Moves built the site, and that's where we have a 33 Golf, and that has 70 cabins now. Mark and I have spent time interviewing the folks before they got in the cabins, and now we're interviewing them after they've gotten the cabins. And the things that we are hearing about individuals who can now be in a room, it's just 8 by 8, but it has a bed, it's comfortable, it has heating, that they can decompress, they can get their ID, they don't have to worry about their stuff getting stolen, and they can begin to have dignity and hope. I mean, it's amazing that in the short time that those cabins have been in place, that what we have seen among the individuals that are there. So that's an example of residents coming to the city with an idea, bringing our coalition to push that idea further and getting the city to buy into it. And now it's becoming, of course, we're going to do cabins, which is awesome. Now, the Mission area, Mission District, there's plans for 70 more, fully supported by the Supervisor Ronan in that district. And we see this as the beginning of a lot more. And I just want to add a couple more things. Like, the question is, how does our voice make a difference? I believe that after the 2 years that we're doing this, that we have begun to change the narrative. We started out by saying the city should treat homelessness like a natural disaster, as it treated COVID. You need to act like, the water levels are rising. There is no more time to wait. And it can't just be another department in the city that, clocks out at 5 and gets back in at 8. Not to say that they aren't working crazy hours in those departments, because they are, but it takes another level of urgency to cut through the red tape and do things that you wouldn't normally do, that we say every time we talk to a supervisor or the mayor or department head. And for the most part, if it makes you feel heartened, most of them all agree. But I think what our united voice can do, and has already done, and APA, A Place for All is an example, is that we can give the political will and the political cover that is needed to make some of these bold moves that are necessary. So, thanks.
We have some questions from the audience, and if you have questions and they're not submitted, please put your question in the chat, and we'll take a look and try to ask it. Here's one question. Let's see. Are state, federal, and local policies putting barriers to real solutions through mandatory one-size-fits-all legislation that hamstrings nonprofits who've been successful for years? And the question also asks how this is particularly impacting the Salvation Army. So maybe we'll first start with you, Major Matt, if you could talk about how policies from different levels of government affect your ability to launch the way out here in San Francisco, what you're encountering.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for asking it. A lot of people look to the government to solve all the problems, right? And I think it's very clear that a lot of times when the government sets out to do something, I'm not talking about any specific government, just government in general, it ends up taking a long time, costing a lot of money, and not getting the results that you want. That's a pretty common theme. And an organization like Salvation Army, the efficiency of the dollar that is given to us, what we're able to accomplish, goes much further than what the government can do. Now, that's for a number of reasons. One of the issues that the Salvation Army in particular, we find a lot of resistance on is because of our religious background, our religious roots. And I'm a pastor, I'm a minister, and some people are saying, well, it's church and state, you got to be separate. And okay, fine, if that's the way you want to be, that's fine. But the truth is, we get results where we're not forcing anybody to do anything they don't want to do. We're treating people with compassion and respect, and we're turning lives around, and we're doing it at much less cost than the government would be in many cases. One thing that which still makes me scratch my head is all of these hotel rooms that the city has purchased. It seems compassionate. Let's get them off the street. Let's put them in a room. But we are having this massive number of people dying with overdose alone in their addiction, and it's happening in those rooms. And the immediate, let's fix the problem that's by the room, that's fine, but we can't. You got to go beyond that. And groups like the Salvation Army and other organizations like us, we're keep hitting these roadblocks because the government they've got all this money, they've got all this power, they can, fast track stuff. And here we are making plans, and then they throw something there and boom, we've got this massive roadblock we've got to get around. So it is very frustrating. It's difficult. And as Lori said, we're not a nation of laws. We're a nation of political will. And this is groups like this, having people log in and be a part of this, hearing this, we get these conversations started, and the political will, we can start turning the needle.
In the spirit
Mark,
of that
if I could
question,
just chime in as a policy person, federal policy is housing first, and it's been picked up by state and local governments almost everywhere, except for San Antonio is an outlier. And so when we first started talking to people about alternative models, it's, oh no, we only want permanent supportive housing. We only want housing first, which is the very expensive model. And then you also cannot have recovery components under federal and most state and local policies as well. You cannot have requirements that people be in recovery or must participate in services. So one of the models that we had featured in our policy report is called Solutions for Change in San Diego. And they've been enormously successful in helping families, especially, move from homelessness to self-sufficiency. But they have a requirement that people participate in what they call Solutions University. And again, it's workforce and life source training. And people were living in their housing using vouchers, federal Section 8 vouchers. And the federal government used the fact that the people living there were on vouchers to say, you cannot require the people in this unit to be in your program. So they had to shut down capacity enormously. So it's very counterproductive. Programs that are producing results are not funded, and maybe that's fine, we can fund them privately, but just so you know, if you're offering a program that has recovery and programmatic option or requirements, you're not eligible for government funding.
Yeah, Theodore, I see your hand go up.
Yeah, I just, one of the unique elements of the times that we're in now is that there are a lot of dollars being invested in this. So there are room for multiple approaches. I understand I think we were sitting in there was the director of HSH and then the director of HSOC, which goes around and demobilizes encampments. Essentially, there was a question in the audience during an event, and someone asked, why don't we allow folks to use drugs open? We asked the question of drug use inside of facilities, city-funded facilities. And the director of HSH said, we can't tell people what to do in their own homes. And that's fine. I get it. None of us here, we're all adults, we're all grown. We don't want to be told what to do in our homes. But given the amount of capital now that is being dumped into homelessness, there is room for both models. There is room for the harm reduction approach. There's room for the abstinence-based approach. There are rooms for the interim housing approach, given the length it takes, the amount of time it takes to build housing. So I just wanted to say that.
I think this is a really important point to bring out. It's kind of in the details, but I think people on our call, the audience, should really understand these different philosophies and how these play out. In fact, we do have one question, in fact, that asked that whether the Salvation Army has an abstinence-only program, and then asked what the other alternatives are and what other advocates think about that. And this, I think, feeds right into your comment, Theo. So if someone on the panel would like to talk about that, sort of what is the reigning model about harm reduction, and then how does the Salvation Army approach that with abstinence only, and then what is the government's philosophy? How does that affect funding dollars? You want to take that one?
I'll jump in. I mean, harm reduction by definition includes recovery. The term harm reduction is to reduce harm by people using substances. However, it's been interpreted in policy to only mean continuing to use drugs more safely. So it's giving out needles, it's giving out pamphlets on how to use fentanyl safely. It's passing out thousands and thousands of Narcan to reverse overdoses, which, as Major Matt mentioned, in Now that we have people in hotels, there's nobody around to see that they're overdosing, so they're just dying, and so on. But recovery is an important part of harm reduction, and many people would like to be free of the addiction that they're enslaved to. But recovery has, until recently, if you were in a room with homeless advocates and we're talking about recovery, they'd shut you down. That is changing, and people are willing to accept that, yes, recovery does have a place on the spectrum of harm reduction, and it ought to be included in the options that are made available. You can't make anybody go through recovery. It's not, you've got to be highly motivated to go through recovery and be successful. So people have to choose recovery, but it ought to be one of the choices presented, and it ought to be presented in sufficient quantity that everybody who would like that choice can access it, and can access it in the form that they would most like to do so.
Tom, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add on to what Theo was talking about as well in regards to Housing First, because I'm not going to sit here and be critical of Housing First, but I will explain something. So 3 weeks ago, I had an opportunity to speak at Stanford in front of the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy Research. And much of the conversation that day was about housing, CEQA, how to, change zoning laws and environmental impact reports so that more housing can be built quickly. And I don't think anybody in that room, including myself, disagreed with any of those changes that need to be made. I think what the problem is that in our efforts to create as much low barrier housing as possible, right? We have thrown, to use a cliche, we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, and that we are not creating an environment where somebody who wishes to be in recovery really has that opportunity to pursue recovery, because it's not about necessarily being abstinent from drugs and alcohol. It's about the pursuit of recovery. I want to make that clear. For so many people that are coming off the street, they're having to start their life over from ground zero, right? And if you put them in an 80 square foot room in the Tenderloin with no sobriety requirements, and they have late stage addiction to illicit fentanyl, that, my friends, is a death sentence. I don't know how else to say it. It may sound extreme, but that is what it is. And that's what I explained to many of those folks in that room. And there was somebody there from the Interagency Council of Homelessness, which is a federal department, okay, that addresses the homeless issue for the United States of America. And they even admitted that Housing First, if implemented correctly, works. I agree. Finland is a great example of how Housing First has worked to end homelessness over there. And a lot of that has to do with the nuts and bolts, the 7 staff for every 21 residents as an example. Whereas here in San Francisco, we average 3 staff per 100 residents inside permanent supportive housing that are supposedly providing those wraparound services. So it's about the correct implementation, amongst other things, the time it takes to bring new housing online, to acquire new housing, to build new housing. Those are all major factors that need to be addressed too. But just getting back to what Theo and then Mary was saying too, is we need to create a space for people that want to be away from that environment, to be able to be away from that environment. And that's kind of what they're doing with the Salvation Army. And that's why I support it, because again, if you had taken myself, I'm going to use myself as an example, in 2018 and placed me in an SRO at the Boston Hotel on Turk Street, I would not be here talking to you right now. I would either be dead or I would still be out there using. That's the facts, right? And so if we really want to save lives, we need to create enough space for all of this to happen, which does require a massive build out of housing, but it has to have an investment in those wraparound services too, or really we're just warehousing people as opposed to giving them real recovery oriented systems of care. Thank you.
Yes, Major Matt.
I appreciate what you shared there, Tom. I know in watching the documentary, it talks about this one individual who didn't want to kill themselves because they couldn't miss the next fix. If you've seen the documentary, you know what I'm talking about. Addiction is a form of slavery. It's a brutal form of slavery. And we need to ask ourselves, what is the end goal? Is our end goal to assist them to getting back in the driver's seat of their own life? Or are we saying, get in the back seat and we're going to drive you there. We're going to tell you where to go and how to get there. By trying to get them away from this addiction, we are actually giving them their freedom back so that they can have freedom in life. Sometimes it takes that additional difficult accountability, structure to be able to bring someone to a point where they can make the change and then they can be in control of their life once more. And it's a philosophical issue people have a big deal with, but that's something the Salvation Army and a lot of other agencies have operated on. And we see it to be very successful. And that's what we continue to do. I know there's other methods, but that's what we do.
And Gabriel, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just building on Theo's comment about there's room for these different approaches. And I think Tom's comment about like we have to have that, where the narrative among everyone now is starting to be this openness to this, right? To including this. And I think we need to shift from an openness and there's room to we are not going to solve this until we include it, that we have to have all of these things and they have to work in an integrated, effective behavioral healthcare system. And until we completely shift that narrative and culture to we have to have all of it, as opposed to still debating, we're not going to get there.
And I would just actually throw in a little editorial comment as well from our perspective at RescueSF. One issue we see with San Francisco that relates to this point is the fact that all these policies that are affecting people who are unhoused and have behavioral health issues are being dealt with by a variety of different organizations that don't work together very well. And there are gaps, right? They're silos. And you find that, of course, all kinds of government, but especially it relates here. Just as we see, like with the success of Haven for Hope came from the fact that this unification of housing with services in a very thoughtful way. That's also a major, Matt, what you're proposing to do with the Way Out. It's all unified in one facility with one program that's comprehensive. It lasts over time. It involves a whole layered approach to services and housing. And in San Francisco, we just don't have that. If they want to comment on that, Theo, maybe perhaps you, because you're focused on government right now as well. It doesn't seem to be that awareness and that ability to coordinate inside the city.
Well, yeah, I think that is our policymakers are doing us a little bit of a disservice, right? And you sort of see the result of that, of what happens, right? The voters are fed up. We saw last night with the election that there is the silent majority isn't necessarily silent anymore. We saw that, even if you look back to sort of Prop C and the reluctantness to get that passed, and there's all this money, and now we're waiting for sort of common sense solutions. I've just been fascinated, to look at just sort of the opportunity that we have, being San Francisco, being as progressive as we are, being only 2% of the electorate in California. The things that we do here spread to the rest of the state and then the rest of the nation. And I think folks are looking at us. Folks are watching us. It's very clear that people all across the world are watching us to come up with something that is viable, something that's innovative, something that's cost effective. And I'm not confident right now that we are rising to that occasion.
Well, I think that's actually a hopeful comment, the fact that we are pointing towards action and mindful of time. So why don't we wrap up there? Like I say, I think we've had a very inspiring and insightful discussion of an excellent documentary Beyond Homeless, Finding Hope, which I think was exactly what Mary intended when you put the documentary together, that communities around the city, around California, around the country would have these kinds of conversations. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for taking time out to join us today for a really tremendous discussion. Thank you for your dedication and wish you well. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today. RescueSF is an advocacy organization, which means that we support government policies that'll make a difference. We believe the topics discussed in the film, such as the importance of behavioral health services, the value of the Haven for Hope model, the potential of the Salvation Army's project, can have an impact here in San Francisco. We are actively engaged with these issues, and we look forward to discussing next steps with you in our future communications. So thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for organizing this. This is great.
Thank you.
Everybody.